Good morning, everyone. My name is Cameron Gleeson. I'm Senior Investment Strategist at BetaShares. Today, we're going to be talking about geopolitical risk, which is obviously a very topical area of conversation with a lot of our clients. And we're joined today by the gentleman to my right, Cameron Mitchell. Cameron is Head of Geopolitical Risk at ANZ. I think he's the perfect guest for us to be talking to today. He talks to ANZ clients providing geopolitical risk assessments and advice, but also the senior management team of ANZ. He also lectures at the National Security College at ANU. He previously was head of geopolitical risk at HSBC, worked at the Australian Defence Force, and I believe you had operational deployments of both Iraq and Afghanistan. And you're a published author on these sorts of topics. So great to have you here, Cam.
Yeah, nice to be here, Cam. Thanks.
Great. So I should just make a note of the fact that today we're obviously going to hear from Cam, and that will be the bulk of the conversation. But we'll also talk a little bit about what our clients are thinking about from an investment standpoint. Nothing I say about BetaShares funds is a specific endorsement from Cam as to a BetaShares product. Please seek your own personal financial advice. Information is general in nature only. But we want to make this a conversation. We want to make it interactive. So we're hosting this webinar through the GoToWebinar platform. You can see on screen there the widget how you can ask a question. So please, as we're talking throughout, feel free to type a question in. We'll endeavour to pose those questions to Cam if we get time. I'm sure we'll get plenty of these questions. So hopefully you get a chance to answer your question as we go throughout today's session. We'll also send a recording of this session or a link to a recording if you happen to have missed the session or you wanted to watch it on replay. Great. So a bit about BetaShares. I'm sure that as you subscribe to this webinar, you're probably well familiar with BetaShares as one of the leading Australian ETF providers. We've now got over 100 funds available, including a wide range of exchange-traded funds available on the ASX. And I guess the stat I'm most proud of is there's more than a million Australians who choose to trust BetaShares with their wealth and invest in our fund. So I thank you for your support. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Cam to take us through the landscape and we'll learn a little bit about what the next decade holds for us.
Super. Thanks, Cam. Really nice to be with you this morning. Look, geopolitical landscape is obviously a bit fraught at the moment, and it's also increasingly unpredictable. So, yeah, look, no one has a mortgage on this stuff. But what we've done at ANZ is to try and capture the most pertinent geopolitical themes we think that matter to business over the next 10 years. So that's basically going to be the thrust of the session. Before we get into that, it's probably worth thinking about how we got here. What's changed in the last few years to get us to think more closely about geopolitical issues from within the investment standpoint. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this slide. Clearly, we've got more major power competition in the world, specifically between the US and China. But it's not just about the US and China. The world's getting increasingly multipolar, with governments that are really flexing their geopolitical muscle by using some economic coercion tools, by using sort of economic security policies, or more traditional just hard power to try and bring about geopolitical advantage. And of course, that creates impacts for the business community. I think this major power competition piece was first, the business sector really first experienced this through government action. So traditionally, I think in the mid-2000s, for example, in the sort of financial services sector, the real concerns were around technology export controls, sanctions, and so on. That's really started to change because, of course, traditionally geopolitical concerns were top down. You had government making decisions that would create impacts for businesses. We're actually starting to see some bottom-up impacts as well, and that's that's been driven by the management of firms, but also the investors, activist investors. I think the best example of that was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The aftermath of that invasion, we saw upwards of 1,000 Western companies either freezing their operations in Russia or leaving the market. That was not driven by sanctions or policy requirements from governments. A lot of that was self-initiated. So it becomes a little bit messier when you've got I guess, non-state actors increasingly making geopolitical decisions. It makes the landscape a little bit messier and also, obviously far more interesting from an investment perspective. So I think that's important to mention off the top. And then the other major issue, of course, globally is the rise of these systemic impact events. The systemic impact events are those things that are going to create significant shocks over a long period of time, and they're quite hard to, the systemic impact events themselves are not hard to identify, but the second and third order impacts, of course, are. It's very easy for us to draw our attention towards those shock events, things like COVID, obviously a systemic impact event. It's harder for us to think about those longer term systemic impact events, but I think they're equally important. The first of which, of course, is China's rise. The international reaction to China's rise for a number of decades was almost universally positive, certainly from a business standpoint. And in the last 5 years or so, potentially 10 years, we've seen a real shift. Not a binary shift away from positive to negative, but more concerns around what China's rise actually means to a lot of markets elsewhere. And I think if you look at the graphic on the right, that really, for me, sums it up. China's share of global production is now higher than the next 9 global manufacturing economies combined. When you've got that much heft in the international system, it's going to create anxieties from other countries. And that's, of course, I think part of the driver behind some of the export controls we've seen, some of the sanctions we've seen, and other tariffs. So I think that's off the top an important factor to think about. The second big impact, I think, is partisan US foreign policy. A really good example of this, of course, is the Paris Climate Agreement, where we saw the Obama administration join Paris, the Trump administration leave Paris, the Biden administration rejoin it, and then in all likelihood, the Trump administration leave it again. That makes it very difficult for other international stakeholders to work with the United States on long-term solutions to some of these global challenges. And of course, we're seeing some of these changes as well over Russia policy, for example, where there'll be potentially a divergence between the Biden administration's approach and the incoming Trump administration's approach. And then finally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine itself, I think, is a significant systemic impact event. It's hard for us to maintain our focus on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the second and third order implications, of course, because the war has been running for 2 years now. But you think about the global realignments that it's created, the deepening relationships between some countries, the breaking relationships from others, and of course that impact on financial dislocation where the Russian economy is being largely frozen out of Western financial systems. And then of course the impacts it's had to energy and to food supplies around the world. I think the sort of long-term impacts of this are still being felt and things that we should be keeping a pretty close eye on. So that's the big picture. The other point, I think, in this lead up to this untidy decade that I'm going to get to, I think we need to remember that the security and economic considerations that governments take are becoming increasingly intertwined, and that's leading to increasing levels of economic security policy. And really at root cause of this, I think, is dwindling levels of trust between countries. I think a really healthy or helpful quote is that trust leaves on horseback and returns on foot. So you can imagine with the US and China, that really sort of brittle and sort of fracturing level of trust between the two sides because of the actions that each have taken over the last 10 years or so, very hard to rebuild that trust. So perhaps I'm a little bit more skeptical about maybe sort of sudden changes in policy towards China from the US or vice versa.
It's a bit like Australia and China, really. It's taken some time for the current government to rebuild relations.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good example. You know, we were in the relationship was in the deep freeze for a few years. It's really taken quite some time to build that trust up to a point where some of those economic restrictions have been lifted. I think a quick rule of thumb, if you think about this economic security policy, if you think about how governments look at their economies, traditionally it was all about growth, and increasingly it's not all about, but it's increasingly about security. So if governments look at their economies through a national security lens, I think the lens in 2016-17 was quite narrow. I think they looked at trade and they looked at technology through this economic security lens, particularly with the US and China, with the tit-for-tat tariffs we saw, and then, of course, with the US efforts to try and curb Huawei 5G network rollouts. You can start to see that technology piece playing an important role. The aperture of that lens started to expand in 2020 with the onset of COVID. Countries, or at least governments, started to get increasingly concerned around supply chains in the healthcare system in the first instance. So where did you get your vaccines? Did you have the capacity to develop your own PPE at home? And then, of course, when lockdown started to occur to protect citizens, entire supply chains were dislocated. And I think supply chains started to be looked at through a national security lens. And then finally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was phase 3, I think, which is when that aperture expanded really to its current level. And that's where countries start thinking about energy and food supply through a national security lens as well. Europe being a really good example in the way they think about their energy security post the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's kind of where we go, that's how we got here. I'm going to skip through this slide very briefly, but it just shows you the number of economic security tools that governments are employing around the world to build up some of that security that they're looking for. You've got traditional measures like inbound investment screening, the Foreign Investment Review Board, for example, but now we're getting more novel approaches as well. Outbound investment screening, particularly from the United States. We're also seeing things like anti-coercion instruments being rolled out in the European Union against countries that are using their economic power in a punitive or coercive way. So I think this is the landscape we need to get used to. So that's how we got to where we are today. The next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to run through this untidy decade with you before handing back over to Cam. I think the US national security strategy in 2022 had this fantastic sentence or couple of sentences in it. It's not a US driven or angled update. I feel like these two sentences or this sentence, sorry, really summarizes the way in which countries around the world are feeling about the next 10 years being this decisive decade in terms of dealing with pandemics, dealing with climate change, and relationships between major powers, either reaching some kind of modus vivendi or deteriorating further. So with that in mind, that's the terms of reference. We're looking at the next 10 years. I'm just going to show you a few slides on this untidy decade. So the first is the uneven energy transition. I think it's now abundantly clear that the energy transition is going to face headwinds. I'm not suggesting we're not going to have the transition in the time in which we would like it, but you're going to have geopolitical realities getting in the way in some ways, or potentially accelerating the transition in others. More specifically, I think you're going to see the fossil fuel producing powers using their geopolitical heft in ways to preserve their advantage. For example, OPEC plus production cuts. Of course, that's started to shift, but that's the sort of heft I think we're seeing from them. And then on the flip side, you've got these renewable energy superpowers, if you like, particularly China, increasingly using their geopolitical heft in that space to preserve their advantage. And as you can see from the graphic on the right, China's dominance of the critical minerals supply chain has given them a real advantage, which they're starting to use through export controls of key critical minerals, often in response to US export controls in the technology space. So I think this is definitely something we should be watching. A final point on this is I'm going to talk about supply and demand mismatches in a couple of my slides. The most obvious one is in the energy transition, where there's been a surge in demand for renewable energy, really since, I'd argue, 2022 being a watershed year. You got the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which of course provides more government funding for these kinds of issues or initiatives. And then you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which got the Europeans thinking very much about economic security and really doubling down on heat pumps and other renewable energy sources. And I think the supply of those sources really struggled to keep up. Not universally. We hear a lot about a glut of PV panels, for example. So there'll be some things where we've got excess supply, but that's going to become a geopolitical factor as well, as countries either accept or don't accept some of those excess levels from some countries. The N and untidy is all about new trading patterns. And very briefly, this slide summarizes the fact that you've got the United States and its allies and partners at one end of the spectrum going through this nearshoring, onshoring and friendshoring phenomenon. I think that's likely to continue, even with a change of government in the United States. And it's a minor miracle I've made it to about slide 8 without talking about the incoming Trump administration. But I think when it comes to economic security policy, the Trump administration is going to continue a lot of the policies we've seen from Biden, particularly in critical minerals and so on. So it will evolve, it will shift, but I think more broadly, the idea that the US does work with allies and partners for some of those economic security focused considerations, I think is likely to hold. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got what one of our political risk consultancies that we use is called the axis of the excluded. So these are the countries that have been frozen out of the US financial system, or the Western sort of led financial system. At this point, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Those countries are working far more closely together as well. So trade patterns are starting to shift. China is not in that grouping. China is one of the many countries that are sitting within the middle of those two extremes that are really trying to hedge between either more overt or more sort of potentially hostile for some countries US foreign policy or breaches of sovereignty, at the other end of the spectrum. And I think it's worth noting that China is the biggest economic partner of Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And that's really shifted since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you are starting to see trade patterns globally shifting, and that's an important thing to know. The T in Untidy is all about trusted tech. Perhaps unsurprising, I think, to most people in the audience, we're seeing the development or an emergence of two fairly clear technological ecosystems, one US-driven or one US-led, and the other Chinese-led. Europe have tried to sort of create a third pole, but I think the reality is with intellectual property dominance for the United States, semiconductor dominance and so on, it's really two ecosystems. And that's going to be increasingly important for the advanced economies that are looking to use emerging technologies as part of their new economy. I think being forced to choose sides is less of an issue for countries that are further down the value chain. They might be mining-dependent economies or in the developing world, developing market economies. And this is why we're seeing a contest between between the US and its allies and partners on the one hand, and China on the other, for influence in the global south. And this graphic on the right shows you the countries that have said yes to Huawei 5G rollouts in green, with the exception perhaps of India, Vietnam, and Russia. It is almost an analogous map of the global south. So I think that contest is going to be worth flagging. The I in Untidy is all about industrial policy. And this is really important. Clearly, we're in a bit of a new world here in terms of paradigm shifts. I think the biggest takeaway from this entire slide deck, or at least my slides, is that it's the return of the state baby in markets, and again, driven largely by that economic security concern. When the largest economy in the world and the biggest exponent of the free market traditionally has $3.5 trillion worth at latest estimates of government funding for various projects, you know that you're in a bit of a different world. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor in the United States, talks almost as much about the US economy as Janet Yellen. I think that's, again, fairly instructive in the way in which the US is thinking about things. Opportunities here, of course, with a lot more government spending in various sectors, and I know Cam's going to talk a little bit about that in his session. But I guess the one caveat to this is, with all this industrial policy going on, it's hard enough getting your industrial policy position correct, or at least appropriate, to factor in domestic political considerations, let alone trying to unify them with international partners and allies. So I think that's going to be a big feature where we're going to see a lot of friction between countries that you would think would want to cooperate more on industrial policy outputs, and that's something we should be watching. That's the graphic I've got here, just an apocryphal tale of the Stellantis plant in Canada that had about $1.5 billion of Canadian government funding, which moved to about $10 billion worth of Canadian government funding in order to prevent their packing up and moving down to the US to tap into some of those IRA grants and so on. So, not particularly efficient, but again, with economic security policy the way it is, and the Canadians deciding EVs were part of that picture, they were going to spend what they needed to. So
and Stellantis is that European auto manufacturer conglomerate. They were looking to produce EVs and obviously take advantage of those tax credits.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think that's a really good example where there'll be a number of, obviously with the Trump administration, potential shifts in the IRA. I don't know if the new government will be quite as comfortable providing grants to foreign companies. That's something to think about. But in all likelihood, I think the IRA as it stands, or at least what it represents, is unlikely to change too much. The D in Untidy, I'm sort of conscious of time here. I'm going to skip through the last couple of slides. No surprises when the world is facing a bit of a trust deficit and live conflicts in the Middle East and Europe. Defense spending is going to go up. This graphic shows you where the defence spending levels are around the world. This is a really useful resource from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, I think it is. And you can see really that there's been a trough of defence spending in that sort of 1990s period, what people called the Cold War peace, the post-Cold War peace dividend. Fantastic when you're not facing adversaries and your trust levels are high and globalization is a focus. But when you're starting to compete with each other in this major power contest, of course, there's a sudden surge, and this is back to that supply and demand issue I mentioned, huge surge in demand for defence equipment around the world and no requisite increase in supply, because those defence industrial bases around the world have really become quite moribund because of a lack of demand. A lot of the increases in defence spending you're seeing here are actually around operational increases, so that's worth flagging as well. Now we're starting to see countries want kit and want kit very quickly, and that's why I've got a picture of a South Korean tank with a Polish flag on it. We're starting to see quite novel relationships emerge as countries try and find countries they can trust to provide them with defence equipment as quickly as possible. The Poles couldn't get the 1,000 armoured fighting vehicles they were looking for from the UK, the US or the Europeans in a timely fashion, and they've now gone to the South Koreans. With that deep industrial base that they have, they can actually provide those pieces of equipment quickly.
And sorry, I was going to, I wanted to cut in here, Cam, because firstly I want to make sure that we spend as much time with you, the focus. I think this is really interesting stuff. I guess just one question that I have and we've had from clients has been around that, that potentially Trump, he has had pacifist tendencies in the past. How do we sort of see the outlook for, the defence industry if, for example, he's able to, let's just say, draw a conclusion on the, Ukrainian war? Is this net positive or negative for the defence industry in terms of the spending that we're going to see? And is it going to be more a growth in spending in Europe and less spending in the US? How do you sort of see that playing out?
Yeah, well, look, I think first up, it's important to think about the amount of money that's being sort of offered up for defence regeneration or rejuvenation. We hear a lot about the Europeans, 200 billion euros, I think it is now, for efforts to try and streamline what they're doing in the defence sector. That's great. The issue, of course, in part will be what bang for buck do you get? And the Europeans, I think the Kiel Institute's just put out a really useful article or a report on this. Some of the costs per unit for European equipment is incredibly high. That's challenging. 30mm ammunition, for example, I think from the Germans is 9 times more expensive than the equivalent round from the Americans or the British.
Right.
So I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. More broadly, it doesn't stop the desire to see defence regeneration. I don't see how Donald Trump, with the best of intentions, can bring about some sort of lasting peace settlement in Europe, which would then completely undermine or at least reverse the trend towards more defence spending in Europe. I think there are some structural realities there that are going to prove very difficult for even an incoming US president to change. He clearly has agency, but I think as we've seen in previous examples where Trump has gone in with a very counter-structural approach, i.e., summits with Kim Jong-un to try and change the North Korean-US relationship, the Phase 1 trade deal with China after 3 years of really tough sort of tit-for-tat tariffs. Neither of those have really played out, have had a lasting impact because they're counter-structural. So I think for Trump to bring about a peace settlement in Ukraine, he really needs to get the other stakeholders to agree with the position. And I think there's still a lot of daylight here. So I think for me, that's why I don't see a shift in the structural approach to more defense spending. Your point around the United States, yes, I completely agree that Trump likes to avoid wars. He's more into doing deals to end wars. I don't think there's a comfort in having US troops in large numbers overseas, but that does not mean that he's not very much focused on restoring the United States deterrence to prevent countries from doing things that would be against the US interests. So for me, you can have a US president that doesn't want costly wars overseas, but is also committed to significant increases in defense spending at home to build up that deterrence. And I think that's probably what we're going to get.
Great.
Yeah. Last slide before we go over to Cam, is ideology. So the last eye in untidy. I think, again, even with a change of government in the United States, we are seeing a more ideological foreign policy streak from countries, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, back to that systemic impact event that I mentioned. We hear, perhaps not so much in 2024, but certainly 2022 and 2023, we heard a lot of rhetoric around autocracies versus democracies. The messaging has changed, but I think the policy approaches have really not. You're still seeing the G7 announcements focusing more on democracy promotion, building, I guess, ballast between allies and partners, the democracies in that space. And you're also seeing, China and other countries arguing that perhaps democracy isn't the best fit for all governments of the world, and they are offering up this alternate model, which I think will be a real contest, to be honest, in the global south over the next 10 years for influence. The map on the right is the UN General Assembly votes after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think that perhaps surprised a lot of the G7 countries. A lot of the countries in the world just don't want to be involved in this, in these kinds of conflicts away from home, and I think that's going to be something that's going to start to impact in policy formulation going forward.
Yeah, it's actually sort of interesting, isn't it? Because we do in Australia, we sort of sit here and we assume that the West and the rest of the world is united against Russia, but you look at that map and you see that people essentially want to abstain from putting their I guess their lot in with one side or another, and there can be an advantage to that as a country to remaining neutral.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think from an investment standpoint, the big takeaway there is you can't just look at the globe as this analogous globalized place where you can just start to invest in certain economies. You need to understand that some of them, the governments will feel more predisposed to more authoritarian government or and less sort of market friendly approaches. So these are the kinds of things that I think are going to play out over time. And then final point, I've just got a graphic here of the G20, a really good reminder that some of these multilateral organizations, the United Nations as well, I'm not saying that they're no longer fit for purpose, but they're facing increasing headwinds. You're not really going to get major policy outcomes from multilateral groupings when you've got a president in the US that's said, he doesn't think these big multilateral groupings are particularly helpful for the United States, and you have Russia, a UN Security Council member, in a war. So of course it's going to be abstaining or saying no to any resolutions that run counter to its interests, and that includes, sanctions against North Korea and so on. So when you've got that kind of friction within those multilateral groupings, there's a preference to then work in minilateral groupings like the G7, like the Quad, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS and so on. So I think we're starting to see more movement in those smaller groupings of countries. That's a very quick and dirty overview as far as we see it of the decade to come. But I'll now hand over to Cam to talk a bit more about some of those market implications.
Yes. Oh, look, I thought that was fantastic. And what I want to do is just talk about what a lot of our clients are seeing and what we're seeing from the investment landscape. But I'll also, draw Cam back in because I think there's some, really relevant sort of areas of conversation here, and we've already had some good questions come in. So I want to talk about, what we're hearing from clients. And I'd say, one of the predominant concerns of investors is tariffs and what this means for the investment landscape. Overwhelmingly, since the US election, we have seen investors allocate to US equities, much more so than global equities or Australian equities. It has been a view that the US economy will do well, that the policies that are going to be put in place by Trump are going to be very pro-growth. Some concerns about inflation, but generally the US economy is in sort of really good stead for strong growth. And the only knock on that is that a lot of people suggest that US equities are quite expensive. And I show here on this chart the price to earnings ratio in black of the broad US equity market as measured by the S&P 500 index. So that's the market capitalization weighted index, which has very large allocations to the large tech companies. And through COVID, when earnings were hit, we typically see that the price to earnings ratio fell pretty dramatically. So there was a step up in the valuations over COVID due to short-term hits to earnings. But beyond that, if we take out COVID, that black line creeping up over the last year and a half does illustrate that the US equity market, as a market capitalization weighted view of US equities, does look relatively expensive. However, if we look at the orange line, that is what we call the S&P 500 equal weight index. This is a weighting of those top 500 companies in equal shares. It's a more, I should say, more representative, picture of the US equity market. And what we see there is that the valuations or the PEs are really at their long-term averages. So in some senses, the US equity market, in a broader definition, a more spread definition across sectors that aren't necessarily all high growth tech, actually does look okay. Now, I show here the sector makeups of the 500 market cap weight on the left-hand side versus the equal weight. We can see that technology is the largest sector in the market cap weight index for the reasons I just talked about. We think about the sorts of industries that are likely to benefit from deregulation, from reshoring, from favorable tax policies. The equal weight index has its largest allocations to industrials and to financials. And so we'd say that in a, if you like, a US first approach to foreign policy and to tax policy and trade, the equal weight index is actually quite favorably dispositioned. It also has a greater orientation to the US economy. So a greater share of the revenue within the equal weight index comes from the US. So it gives you somewhat of a hedge against geopolitical tensions and trade wars, whereas the 500 has a lot of exposure to revenue earned in the emerging market and in Europe. So the equal weight index is, from our perspective, trades at a roughly 30% discount to the market cap weight index. Equal weight's a really good way of playing that US economic strength, and the earnings outlook for the equal weight is very strong. We've started to actually see that play out already. The pivot from that AI narrative to more of a macro driver of the overall market started when Powell addressed Congress back in early July, and we can see the orange line, the equal weight index, outperforming the broad market. Broad market pulled down somewhat by tech companies. So that's already something that's starting to play out, and we think that there's a strong case that will continue to play out. On tariffs, the next thing I just wanted to draw people's attention to, because I think this is quite interesting. This is on the left-hand side. I show a chart of total Chinese exports for a long period of time and highlight the point in time when Trump was last in power as to when he started instituting tariffs against China. And it's interesting to note that while Chinese exports to the US did fall away as a result of tariffs, China's overall exports to the rest of the world actually held up, and we saw growth through COVID. So it's sort of interesting to sort of think about that, whether China was able to skirt tariffs by exporting to third-party countries, and then those goods then found their way to the US. And maybe just to bring Cam in here, I mean, is China going to be able to play that same third-party sort of game this time, or are things different given we've got that universal tariff and the China tariff? How does China sort of, view, or what does China's outlook look like in terms of tariffs?
Yeah, look, Cam, I mean, I can't speak definitively on that, of course, because it's still a little bit of a black box in terms of what the Trump administration is going to do in the tariff space. My sense is that, given that Trump's talked about tariffs as a useful tool for 40 years now, the fact that there's $350 billion of goods, I think, still under tariffs that were rolled out during the first Trump term, the idea that tariffs aren't coming, I think, is pretty unlikely. The question is, what's the extent of the tariff impact? Xi Jinping obviously gave a speech on the margins of the APEC summit last week. He talked about 4 red lines in US-China relations. One of those was constraining China's economic rise. So that'll be interesting in terms of how the US responds. My sense is that there are going to be some efforts to roll out tariffs. We're already hearing that universal tariffs may be an effort to try and roll those out through the Congress rather than through executive order, which have traditionally been the approach for tariff impositions under national security auspices. So with that huge caveat out of the way, let's say that China does experience some sort of additional tariff pressure. I think it'll be harder for them to deal with this time around. There's been a couple of shifts since 2018. Firstly, the RMB is weaker than it was at that point in time, so efforts to weaken the RMB to offset the impacts of tariffs, I think, are going to be harder to achieve. The China Plus One phenomenon that we started to see, where Chinese manufacturers started to produce more finished goods in places like Mexico and Vietnam. That's kind of happened already. Harder to do that a second time around, particularly when you've got the US. Certainly from the campaign trail, we've heard that from a tariff standpoint, the Trump team will be looking at some of the loopholes that were used the last time around to circumvent sanctions. Mexico and Vietnam, with the balance of trade they have with the US, are probably up there in terms of where the US wants to go with its tariff policy. So I think China would be impacted. And then the other two things, of course, is after COVID, with that stimulus in the United States, of course, that helped Chinese exports. We don't have that stimulus as much as we did back then. And then the other final factor, of course, was, if I keep going back to this like a broken record, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia is actually, as a market, yes, of course, it's not the United States, but it did end up soaking up quite a lot of Chinese exports over the last couple of years, given that they're unable to buy goods from other places in the way that they were used to before. I think all of those things have already played out. You're not really going to get a second bite of the cherry. So I think it will make things a little bit harder for China if the US does go down that tariff route.
And we also sort of show on screen there the other largest exporters to the US there. You mentioned Mexico, Canada, obviously, Germany. Germany's industrial base is incredibly important to their economy, and the net exports of manufactured goods that go from Germany to the US versus vice versa means that you'd suggest that they're potentially somewhat exposed there too, right? As that it's really going to be focused on manufactured goods that we're going to see Trump target. One country that
I was going to say, Cam, just very quickly on that, it's a superb chart because it does show you who's got the biggest balance of trade deficit or surplus, but surplus in this case for the US. But the other thing that's worth thinking about is Germany is fourth on the list, but if you think about the EU collectively, it's first. So that's a big issue in terms of EU-US relations going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, one country which I think is actually quite interesting in this whole mix. So we've talked a lot to clients about where they're seeing interest, and potentially countries that may in fact have a tailwind from a heightened level of protectionism. Because I did talk about the fact that tariffs are likely to hit goods and not so much services. If you look at India as a country, it's followed a different model to the development path of a lot of East Asia, which was generally export-oriented growth. If you look at a place like Taiwan, the share of of exports to GDP is extremely high. A lot of India's growth, which sometimes is misunderstood, is actually internal consumption. So it's domestically oriented economy, roughly exports to GDP, roughly sitting at 20%. But if you look at where those exports are, like they are becoming an absolute world leader in the export of services, and whether that be through outsourcing services, business processes, IT consulting. And this chart really illustrates the growth in their services industry, and that they've developed these great hubs in various cities, particularly in the Indian South. And so where India is able to still exploit, if you like, growth and demand for their services, and where they're able to develop a bit of a cost advantage against China for low value manufacturing, India is perhaps a country, given it sort of straddles the geopolitical divide as well, it's actually quite well placed for, if you like, foreign direct investment from both sides of the fence, as well as being able to still access markets for its exports. So I think India is a country that's well placed. And the other one that seems to me quite well placed would be the UK. The UK, if you look at the US's measure, actually has a trade surplus. The US has a trade surplus with the UK as the US measures it. And if you look at the exports from the UK to the US, 70% of them are services. So financial services, travel, professional services and alike. The UK's number one import from the US is crude oil. And if we see, Trump, drill baby drill, reducing the cost of energy for a energy importer is critical. So I think the UK, cheap valuations in the UK, less trade exposed than the EU, which is a much more trade-oriented economy. I think the UK is also relatively well placed on the world stage. So that's an exposure in Asia and in Europe beyond the US. Worth talking a bit about commodity markets, because commodity markets are heavily dependent on global growth and trade. One that I sort of find very interesting has been this sort of structural uplift in demand for gold. And if you look at the purchases by central banks, this has been oriented to if you like, countries that want to preserve neutrality and countries that you would say are outside the US axis. Cam, you did touch on it there, but we sort of saw the ability of the US to sort of weaponize the financial system and freeze assets. I mean, are you sort of seeing that gold has a greater role to play in the way that countries seek independence from the US financial system, or?
Yeah, I think Cam, obviously, this is a great debate topic. The future of the US dollar's dominance. Look, at the moment, I think we're all pretty aware there is no alternative to the US dollar, but that's not stopping countries that are wary, I guess, of US foreign policy shifts from trying to insulate themselves against what may come. And I think your graphic really neatly summarizes it. The surge in gold has really been since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and talk of freezing Russian assets overseas. I think there's a bit of a connection there. I'm not going to make a prediction as to where things go from here, but broadly speaking, I think if you think about what countries are doing, we're hearing about alternate payment systems coming out of the BRICS meetings. We're hearing about obviously more gold being bought by central banks of countries that might be more concerned around where US foreign policy goes in the future. Far more commodity trades being done in local currencies and so on. I don't think it's really creating an existential threat to the US dollar's dominance at this stage in time, but it's an interesting lead indicator, I think, to see where there'll be a bit of a chipping away as countries try and build up some sort of ballast against what may come from US policy in the future.
Yeah.
Interesting note here too, Cam. I'm trying to recall. I'm pretty sure during the campaign trail, Trump mentioned that countries that are seeking to de-dollarize will be the focus of close scrutiny from the US government. So I think it's going to be an interesting one.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, just thinking about the gold price, we've seen really interesting movements this year. If you look at the underlying drivers, we do see that structural demand, for example, what you see here, it can be a very strong driver of the gold price. We also see what I describe as more cyclical factors. So the US dollar tends to, when you see US dollar strength, you tend to see gold weakness. And since Trump's victory, we've seen the US dollars strengthen somewhat. A bit technical, but real rates, or if you want to think about a different way, bond yields have gone up a little bit. That tends to lead to a bit of gold weakness. But I think underlying all that is a sort of long-term structural trend that we see there. So there's a few different drivers of gold, but I think it'll be a really interesting asset class to watch, particularly because it can be quite a good geopolitical hedge for a number of different scenarios. And then turning to another, commodity, which is much talked about with regard to, geopolitical risk. And I want to ask you a question about the Middle East, but this is a chart here which shows the US's production and consumption, as well as their exports and imports of energy. So you can think of oil and gas. Now, historically, the US was one of the original energy exporters, and it wasn't really until the early 70s that I think the US started to become dependent on energy imports. And you can sort of see that in the chart. The lift in demand or consumption of oil and gas just outstripped production in the US. We've reached a really interesting point in the last couple of years where the US again has become energy independent, if you like. And this can be, I guess, a really powerful dampener on the price of oil and gas if you see tension in the Middle East, where the US can export energy, sort of out of the Gulf and alike to Europe. That can really provide a bit of a buffer. We know Trump is sort of suggesting that he's going to reduce regulations and allow the basically greater production of oil and gas. He's hoping to lower the cost of energy, and that's going to be a real boon for manufacturers and consumers in the States. Maybe just to ask you, I mean, there's obviously risks on the other end. If we see an escalation of conflict in the Middle East, how are you sort of viewing the Middle East as it stands?
Look, again, I guess if I go back to what I said earlier about we're not 100% certain of what the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East will be. But if it's counter-structural, if he's starting to try and do things in the Middle East that the other stakeholders aren't willing to do or aren't prepared to do, I think it'll be harder to achieve. And that goes both ways. So if the Trump team is looking to be more adversarial with Iran, but you've got key stakeholders in the region that are looking more to sign peace deals, then it'll be harder to achieve. By the same token, if he's going in there hard to try and stabilize the region, become a bit of a sort of a champion of a peace deal, and other countries aren't ready or prepared to do that, it'll be harder to achieve. That being said, I think we need to watch the next 60 days. We keep talking about Trump 2.0 and what policy positions the Trump administration is going to take. They're very important. But we have to remember that we still have an administration in the US and we have global leaders sort of positioning themselves for what may come on the 20th of January. And I think that means in the next couple of months, there'll be some interesting developments. For me, the Middle East very tenuously looks like it's heading towards I wouldn't say stabilization, but an increased, I guess, a less fraught situation. We've seen some promise from the peace negotiations regarding South Lebanon. We haven't seen a response, of course, from the Iranians to the Israeli strikes a couple of weeks ago.
They were more measured than what was expected, I think, weren't they? Is that the general consensus, the Israeli retaliatory strikes, or there was?
I don't know how I would respond to that. I mean, I think they're probably what I would have thought was appropriate. This idea they were going to be striking oil infrastructure, I always thought was a bit of a red herring, to be honest. But the point is, I guess Israel has degraded Iran's air defense network to a point which I guess gives them an option if Iran responds to then respond again. So that's why I don't want to say with great confidence that I think that we're heading towards stabilization. The sort of momentum towards, I think, stability really is coming from the Gulf. The Gulf states do not want to see this escalation they've seen from Israel and Iran blow over into something bigger. Sorry, blow up into something bigger. They want to see it blow over. And we've seen momentum, obviously, diplomatically between Israel and the Gulf states in the past with the Abraham Accords, much of which was helped with Jared Kushner and the first Trump administration. What we're seeing now, of course, is back-channel discussions, many back-channel discussions between the Gulf states and Iran. That shows me that the Gulf states are looking to see some sort of stabilization in the region. So I guess the Trump administration could go in and then basically be inspired or be influenced by the Saudi Arabian position, or they might take a more hostile approach. So really hard to say at this point in time. But for me, I'm more optimistic about some stabilization in the Middle East next year than I am perhaps about Russia-Ukraine, because of some of those levers that the Trump administration isn't actually holding in its efforts to try and bring about a negotiated settlement in Europe.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, one other commodity that's often been a topic of discussion in the last couple of years has been uranium. And, after the invasion of the Ukraine and the dependence, obviously, on Russian oil and gas, we saw Europe perhaps wake up to its energy dependence on the Russians, and this sort of has created what I hate the term, but it has been a bit of a renaissance in interest in nuclear. We've seen efforts, particularly in the West, to prolong the life or extend the life, and also uprate existing nuclear power plants, so to get more, if you like, energy out of existing plants. So this is sort of a really interesting area, I think, in terms of energy independence. And while oil appears relatively well supplied in the West, uranium will possibly form a pretty interesting part of the mix if countries are looking to decarbonize, because it essentially has zero emissions. So I think that's another very interesting commodity to watch. It's relatively tight supply of a material, and there's also some independencies with Russia there for enriched uranium.
Yeah, Cam, great point. I think the geopolitical angle to uranium is important, of course, because we're not getting uranium out of Russia at the moment. Kazakhstan being a massive exporter at the moment, Western countries accepting those imports. Things might change geopolitically, which will make it a harder commodity to pick up from Kazakhstan. Then suddenly Australia, other suppliers come into scope. And the other point, of course, on this is energy demand is really, really ramping up at a time where we've got an energy transition we're trying to focus on. These kinds of energy sources like nuclear, which sort of sit between, completely renewable and those old fossil fuel options, I think are going to become more popular over time. We've already seen that from Amazon and others that are using this higher energy output from nuclear to start to service their some of the tech requirements they have for data centers and so on. So I think it's going to be a real story.
Yeah. Energy as a theme is just going to be very interesting. I think I agree. And then finally, we did talk a little bit about defence. Share this chart here, but you were referring to the likely, and we're already seeing an uplift in defence spending from Europe. And we know, with that peace dividend we did, and the austerity measures post GFC, that European nations really cut back on defence spending they're realizing the need for independence from the states for their own, security. I think I actually found interesting too was that we saw just a couple of weeks ago that Taiwan was looking to enter into new defense contracts with US suppliers. And I'm interested in your opinion. I think this is quite interesting because if you look at what Trump wants to deliver, he wants to be a champion of US manufacturing. What's an industry that the US leads the world in? It's their defense industry. If he's got massive current surpluses, or sorry, deficits against countries, a great way to reduce those deficits is to have them sign an enormous multi-billion-dollar defense deal. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how trade and defense really play into Trump's hands, and he can also obviously talk about his ability to wean these countries off sort of the US, the US's need to provide security across the globe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of looking at it, Cam. We're hearing, I mean, it's speculation at this point, but you think about South Korea and Japan, for example, countries that traditionally Trump has said, they need to pay their way for some of the US security assurances they receive. One option of doing that is to buy more US equipment. Taiwan, really good example, where they have been, how would I put it? Trump's basically said Taiwan needs to do more for their own defense regarding that broader sort of dynamic between China, Taiwan, and the US. One way to do that is obviously to buy more military equipment. There is actually a pretty long backlog of equipment Taiwan has already paid for that is being supplied to them. So putting another big deal on the table, I think, it doesn't mean you're getting the capability straight away, but it may be enough for the Trump administration to say, in good faith, you're making more of an effort.
Yep.
And then, of course, I guess with Europe, a real tension because the Europeans are trying to do more for themselves. The European Union, the European Commission is looking at where they've got a new defence commissioner. That's a first. They're trying to make sure that they've got capacity to look after their own defence increasingly and to, I guess, structurally shift the defence industry in Europe to become more streamlined and for them to pick up more of their own equipment. That's potentially going to be challenging if they are thinking of one solution to stabilise relations with the US is to buy more US military equipment. So I think it's going to be a bit of a mixed picture.
Yeah.
But no doubt the government in the US will be keen to export defence equipment globally.
Yeah, definitely. And then just to show another slide that I've got here, it's really just talking about, I guess, the relationship between China and the US, and this is public data that the Strategic and International Studies Centre has collated as to espionage efforts, generally through cyber attacks of US corporates and US government, over a long period of time. These are significant attacks. We see sort of escalation in the final two humps there. This is obviously, a growing threat, information security. And you look at the names. I mean, it's essentially all of the Magnificent Seven, all of the largest defense contractors, and very, obviously, institutions like the Pentagon, NASA, and alike. So I think, the domain of cyber is obviously becoming, very relevant and, unfortunately, very important.
Maybe a quick value add here, Cam. I agree 100%. So state-based cyber attacks, or at least incidents, are up. There's different sort of motivations for doing these kinds of things. Some of them are about espionage, trying to pick up a competitive advantage. Others are about degrading, the capacities of your adversaries. So we're looking at things like critical infrastructure threats and so on. And just to make the point that I would argue broadly the threshold for state-based cyber activity in terms of the threshold of acceptable behaviour has really dropped quite a lot since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we've seen significant increases in Russian efforts to undermine critical infrastructure in Europe and so on. I think the risk is, of course, if one country starts to lower the thresholds, then other countries feel emboldened to do similar things. So it's just, perhaps I'm not trying to frighten anyone, but I think that's a reality that we need to be mindful of. And we've seen the response from a couple of NATO summits where they've started to say, a significant cyber attack against critical infrastructure of a NATO partner would constitute a trigger for Article 5, which is the collective response. So there are obviously some concerns around how far state actors can go in this space, and they're starting to be a little bit more of a debate.
Right. Okay. And then, just to round out and to talk through some of the, the investments that people have been looking at within the BetaShares suite. I mentioned the S&P 500 as a if you like a lower cost way to get a broader exposure to US equities, which my belief is maybe more aligned with Trump's policy objectives. QUS. We've got IIND, which provides exposure to the Indian equity market. Of course, we've got the FTSE 100, F100. Talked about various commodity exposures. So we have QAU, which provides currency hedge exposure to gold bullion, or indeed you can invest in global gold miners through miners, and global uranium. You've obviously, we haven't talked about Bitcoin, but up 40%, I think, in the last month or so. So crypt is a thematic within that space. And then global defense and cybersecurity, those funds, particularly HACK, is a very popular fund that many people are aware of. I've got, we've had a wealth of questions come through, and I just wanted to maybe, while we've got Cam, ask a couple of these. There's a question there about the use, or the US condoning Ukraine using missiles in Russian territory, and what that's meant in terms of the change in the nuclear doctrine of Russia, and how do we sort of think about this?
Look, I think this sits in that bucket that I mentioned before of what we should keep our eyes peeled over the next 60 days.
60 days.
So, of course, we know that Trump's coming in on 20 January. What's just happened in Russia, Ukraine over the last 2 weeks, pretty significant. We've obviously seen escalations from Russia, quite significant strikes against the Ukrainian energy grid. That's not new. What is new is that Ukraine is heading into winter. So, of course, strikes against the energy grid at a time where power is needed for warmth will potentially create some humanitarian challenges in Kiev. I think that, I'm not going to say what was the decision-making tree for the Biden administration to approve Ukraine's use of long-range systems. For example, the United Kingdom had been wanting to allow Storm Shadow to be used by the Ukrainians, but there needed to be a bit of a collective agreement between the UK and the United States and other NATO countries. Right. You can't just have one country saying yes, we approve, and others saying no. Yeah. So with the Biden team saying yes, they're more comfortable. We've seen, I think, HIMARS and Storm Shadow, ATACMS, and Storm Shadow both be used in the last couple of days. I'd argue largely in response to those Russian strikes against the energy grid. So for me, I think a little bit of a creeping escalation here that we need to be mindful of, as both sides are trying to get maximum leverage before what inevitably will come, which is more momentum towards negotiations. I don't think that means a peace settlement, but negotiations in the first instance. Look, Russia changing its doctrine, the threshold shift for nuclear use for Russia's nuclear doctrine has been talked about and modified for a number of years. For me, this is an announcement which sits within that sort of posturing space rather than potentially needing to hunker down in expectation of tactical nuclear exchange. I just don't think we're at that point yet.
Let's hope so, and hopefully knowing that Trump's going to come in means that there's sort of an end point, if you like to.
I mean, why would you do that as the Russian leader when you think you've got a US president coming in that you're able to discuss potential outcomes with?
Okay, and we're almost at time. I just wanted to ask one last question. We're Australians, and our relationship with China is important. So how do you sort of see that Australia-China relationship? Where are we at? I mean, are we back to a very friendly relationship, or where do we stand with China?
I mean, obviously, significant shifts in Australia-China relations over the last few years. Obviously, the relationship up until about 2022 had gotten very frosty for a number of reasons, I think, which we all know, the COVID issues, so on. Basically airing some of the areas of disagreement very publicly in the media that made it very difficult to try and bring about progress on the diplomatic front. The Albanese government's obviously taken a different approach where where possible, some of those areas of disagreement are discussed behind closed doors. I think there needed to be a reset, some sort of a reset, or some sort of tension taken out of the relationship, and the change of government in Australia potentially provided that. We also saw in China more internationally a shift in international approach, to more engagement where possible, culminating really in Xi Jinping saying, I think on the margins of APEC, that Australia was their model of how to engage China. So where do I see things going from here? I think that's all positive. I think it's stabilized the relationship from that quite sort of low base. for a number of factors, not driven by a particular government, just the reality of a lot of tension in the relationship for a number of reasons. For me, broadly speaking, both sides have agreed to quarantine their security disagreements from their economic areas of cooperation where possible.
Yep.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The risks, of course, are in a world where you've got economic security policy everywhere. It's very hard to disaggregate your security from your economic forever. So there are obviously going to be, more things that need to be factored in by both leaders. But broadly speaking, I think we're probably at a bit of a high at this point in terms of where we could expect the relationship to go.
Great. Oh, good to finish on a moderately positive note there. I appreciate that, Cam. That was fantastic. It was great to have you in, and I thought that was a really interesting conversation. A lot of really, deep issues there that we covered. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today on the webinar. As I said, you'll be able to access a copy of this. I apologize, we weren't able to ask Cam all of the questions. There were a lot that came in, but hopefully we'll be able to get to certain people with some responses there. Again, thank you very much for joining. Thanks for your support of BetaShares, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for your time, everyone, and thanks for having me, Cam.
Of course.
Cheers.
Cheers.